Bridie, describe how you've responded to the artistic brief of collision and conflict.
So initially, my idea was to have a series of conversations with people who live locally, who live near the wall, and kind of asking them to reflect on essentially the kind of complex reality of life here. And I conducted those interviews on Zoom. I did some of them, and local writer Jude Irwin did some as well. And when we started having these conversations, we very quickly were really staggered and impressed by how insightful and passionate people were in their responses. They were covering all kinds of different themes, stuff like climate change, ownership of the landscape, the environment and how that's being impacted by things like farming and tourism. And what we were really impressed by particularly was that people had this kind of inherent duality in everything that they were saying, that they absolutely loved living here and they wouldn't want to be anywhere else, but yet they fully accepted the kind of conflicts of life here. And because of these amazing conversations, it made me really change what I wanted to do, because I wanted to write a piece that reflected these voices even more. And so I essentially, with support from Greencroft, kind of changed my brief a little bit to being more a kind of essentially like a docu-song, almost like a documentary in song form, where I incorporated snippets from about 10 hours of conversations with people that lived in this area, and I hope that means it kind of reflects them even more than it would have.
Thank you. Are you all right to go over this one? That was lovely,
just go for it.
Yeah. How does your work relate to the location in which it's situated?
So for several reasons, I think this is pretty much the perfect location for this piece. One of actually Carvoren, which is right here, came up quite a lot in our interviews with people, particularly around the theme of climate change. And when you listen to the piece, you'll hear that we were lucky enough to get an interview with Andrew Burley, who is, now let me get his official title correct, I think it's Director of Excavations at the Vindolanda site. And he reflected so eloquently on how climate change is actually affecting the preservation of sites not just above the earth but under the earth as well, and essentially time is running out to do those excavations. So that was one thing why it's just so entirely relevant for it being here. And also some of the places and things that people mention in the clips you can actually see from this walk. For example, there's an example where a lady called Jill talks about being able to see her house on the landscape, and you can actually see it over there. I don't know if maybe we want to get a clip of that later. Yeah. So it's perfect. It couldn't really have worked out better in terms of location.
Thank you. And what has been your overall impression of the project?
I have to say I've just absolutely loved it. I'm really impressed by, it's funny saying this while you're right stood in front of me, Amanda, but I'm really impressed by Greencroft's approach, which is sort of combining being really ambitious artistically but also like genuinely having a commitment to working with the community, and I think it's quite hard to balance that, and I think that Greencroft managed to do that. Also in terms of working with artists, it's really nice to work with commissioners who support you trying new things and being ambitious as well, but also being willing to kind of guide you while you kind of step out of your comfort zone. So that's been a real treat as an artist.
Thank you. Describe how you responded to the artistic brief.
We spend a lot of time messing about in the countryside, capturing sounds as raw material from the landscape, and we're quite familiar with a lot of the landscape in Northumberland, especially sort of north from here. So it was something that we just wanted to do as soon as we saw the brief for it, really. But coming from the point of view that we have, which is that our interest is in the sound of the landscape, everything Roman about this particular part of the country is something that we decided to sort of set aside, really, because it's just so obvious and it's present and it's there. That we wanted to look at what else was going on apart from the Roman history around the area. And considering it's a project that's designed for people who are out walking, out hiking along this stretch of Northumberland, it's something that people often, I think, perhaps forget, that there is all this other stuff going on around, and so that's what we wanted to capture and bring into it.
Great, thank you. Very good. Well
That
done.
was great. Yeah.
Yes. So, how does your work relate to the location in which it's situated?
Well, in this case, with this project, we came out and did a reconnaissance walk ourselves before we put in our proposal, and that was as much about sort of scoping out what kind of potential sound sources, location recordings that we might be able to get. And we had no anticipation of what there might be. And what we did find was that it's a very rich set of places around here that, from our point of view, are very sound rich in particular. And just because of the nature of how it is, the area around Walltown Quarry, which has ponds, it has crags, it has trees, it has all kinds of stuff going on, that seemed to be the place to which we gravitated a lot of the time for capturing the sound recordings that we made. And we kind of surprised ourselves, and we came out and did 3 days of scattered over the last few weeks, 3 days of sound recording out here. And the last day that we came out, which was 2 weeks ago, I think, we thought, we're not going to get much here. It seemed like one of those days where the natural world is just like, we're not that bothered really, we're not going to be up to much going on. And so we were kind of struggling a bit to sort of find things to record, and ended up getting a few recordings, and they've turned out, ironically, sort of counterintuitively, to be a big part of the final piece that we've made. So there's a lot of serendipity in what we do, and we kind of force the hand of chance in a sense by putting ourselves in a position where we have no expectations, and there's a lark. That kind of thing, yeah.
Lovely, thanks, Bert. He's been following us. It's lovely.
Yeah, there's a few of them around here, yeah.
So what has been your overall impression of the project?
It's been good. It's been great actually. We found it very well drawn in terms of the brief. It obviously was enough of a provocation to us to really be enthusiastic about getting involved with it, and to continue to be enthusiastic in doing the work that we did, and making the final piece that we've made. So we really liked doing it, and considering that we've been coming out here in the cold blow and rainy and snow, and it's not been the best time to be out field recording. It's been a Northumberland winter, not the worst winter that it could have been, but certainly we've been snowed on, we've been rained on, we've been blown around a bit, and it's not ideal conditions for making sound recordings. I guess one thing that we kind of like didn't really anticipate is the composition that we've made is actually a winter piece, and a lot of the people who are going to be perhaps coming out here and experiencing the recording in the location in which it's set, which is here, are going to be listening to a winter, really. We've got the sound of cracking ice and the wind, and another little discoveries we made. One of my favourite things actually from the recordings that we made was recording oak leaves on one of the young oak trees that are in the plantation that's been put, sort of deciduous tree plantation that's been put in around the quarry. And it was fascinating to see that amongst the mix of trees, there's rowan, there's hawthorn, there's oak, there's beech, there's birch. In the middle of January, in the middle of this winter, the oak leaves were staying on the tree, whereas everyone else, all the other trees had had their leaves blown well off. And that was a discovery for me, and there is actually a technical term for it, which I can't remember now, but that oak trees and beech trees in particular cling on to their leaves until the spring. They don't drop them until the spring, and it's a bit of a mystery to the scientific world about what's really going on with that. And to get that sound of the rustling of oak leaves, which is something that you wouldn't necessarily notice, but it's there. That was one of my favourite moments, actually.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ben.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
That's brilliant.
Thank you. Ready to go?
Describe how you've responded to the artistic brief.
I think we responded quite well to the artistic brief. I think it was almost on a plate for us, really, because it's following a lot of the way that we've traditionally worked over the years with this sort of sonic journey exploration of sound. And so the chance to come out into a new landscape and explore it and sort of search for hidden, lost, forgotten, archaeological, historical sounds was like very nice, you know, very pleasant thing for us to do. And I think we discovered a lot of those kind of sounds in the landscape and from the history of the landscape, and abstracted a lot of those sounds out of what could appear to be a very open, kind of almost inhospitable landscape. And certainly at the times of year that we were recording things, which were sort of at the ends of the depths of winter, I think we did really quite well and found a lot of very interesting sounds that are kind of buried, immersed in the landscape. And these, I think really a lot of the music and sound that we've worked with over the years has been about abstracting. You know, we work in a very kind of abstract sound world, so in a respect this was ideal for us.
How does your work relate to the particular location in which it's situated?
I think the work that we've come up is very much of the location, you know, with it being made up of so many location recordings. And a lot of those are quite dry, actually. They're in the raw state that we recorded them. Others have been EQ'd and tweaked, and there's been a bit of processing. I think that was a very sort of traditional response for us to sort of gain out of the landscape, you know, to be honest. Don't know.
And what's been your overall impression of the project?
Thoroughly enjoyed doing it. I think it was very well set out, very clear, precise, gave us a lot of scope to sort of explore and kind of work our craft on this environment. Yeah, I don't know whether I can think of much more, actually.
And then I'll probably just ask Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about perhaps the more detail in how you took the recordings in the landscape?
Can we move your microphone inside your jacket, please, because I'm just getting a little bit too much. Just anywhere you can get it.
Sort of. Something like that.
That's fine.
Is that better?
How's that?
That's a bit better.
Yeah.
Maybe put it on the other side, and then it'll be a bit more shielded on the...
Oh, okay.
That's fine. That's anywhere it can go.
Is that better?
That is better, yeah.
Good.
Good stuff.
Excellent.
Right, go for it.
Yeah. So, Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about the detail of how you took the recordings?
Okay, been a long history and tradition in the band of taking location recordings from a variety of situations and places, from urban to the countryside like this. And over the years we've used a lot of differing sound recording devices, you know, starting with cassette tape machines, working through into mini disc and then into little hard disk recorders. And comparatively recently, a year or two back, we got a hold of some really nice pieces of equipment at long last, something that both Ben and myself have really always wanted. and has slowly started to build up a range of different kinds of microphones, which have been invaluable for capturing a lot of the more hidden and lost sounds which I referred to earlier in the previous question. So digital sound recording devices, a variety of microphones, some very typical that people would recognise, handheld, others would be binaural, worn in the ears, geophones recording the sounds of the earth and low frequencies, very low frequency recorders, hydrophones, recording sounds from underwater, up in the lake, the Quarry Lake, and the ponds up in the park there. And that's how we did it, really. We just used our eyes and our ears and got really to some depth into the landscape and immersed ourselves and our recording devices into it, and just kept on coming back up here over 3 or 4 occasions, and took as many recordings as we could see, as we saw fit, and we could find. And then we took those back, edited them, and brought them together into a kind of a soundscape, not an expression I really like using. And I think what we've attempted to do with this is to create some kind of journey within a journey, within the route, the circular route that our sound is going to be, and the other sounds are going to be geolocated on. We've created a journey, really, a sort of sonic journey that we've created using these location recordings, which is something the band has always been very interested in. It's an aspect that we're very interested when we work with sound. And when we perform live, we tend to set ourselves, like a live show in front of an audience, we tend to set ourselves an hour. And within that hour, what we try to do, and people have often described it as such, is take them on a journey. So that's more or less what we found ourselves doing with the recordings for this project, and I would like to think that maybe in some people's minds and ears that we have achieved that.
Thank you, Matt. That was very good.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Good stuff.
Describe how you responded to the artistic brief.
As a composer and a musician, it seemed natural that I was going to write a song. So I've written an original narrative ballad in the tradition of the Northumberland and Border minstrelries, and then David, as a professional storyteller, is choosing to tell a story. We chose Thirlwall Castle as the location, partly because it's a bit of a plum location feature, but what's really nice about it is that we can draw on actual characters and actual people who lived there, which I hope brings to life the scenery, the landscape. It's not just a spurious concept and there's a castle, great. And Northumberland, you can't move for castles, they're everywhere. So having a little bit more of a deeper insight into the background of that hopefully helps people engage more with the landscape. If you come for a walk, if you're anything like I was and forced to go for lengthy walks in bitter weather as a child, rather than it just being a trudge through a landscape, you can engage more if you know what you're looking at. So we were really interested in making the unseen seen, not just in our story has the supernatural bent, which is another appeal for us, but making the unseen seen. So you're not just looking at a castle, you're looking at somebody's home, you're looking at a series of legends, you're looking at a series of stories. You can trace that back until quite recently. I know when I go to an art gallery, I always like to look at the picture, and then you always have to go and read the blurb at the side, because then all of a sudden there's sort of a narrative story that maybe you didn't get, or the symbolism that you didn't understand comes alive. And I think we're trying to hopefully enliven people's heritage, because it is our heritage. If we're walking around here, it is your heritage. So being able to see a deeper, a more fulfilling aspect of that, hopefully, is what we want people to have. So wasn't as good as the first time I did it.
That's perfect.
Is that
Down a bit.
are we all good?
That's it, yeah.
Yep. How does your work relate to the location in which it's situated?
We've taken a story of a Baron of Thirlwall, so I don't know if you can see Thirlwall Castle behind me. It is a legend of fiends and the supernatural, and of hoarding and of gold, all the best elements of all the best stories. I've written an original ballad, a narrative ballad around that, and David's telling the story of our
fiendish Baron of Thirlwall. You'll have to hear the rest of the story. I can't give it away. No spoilers.
Thank you. And what has been your overall impression of the project so far?
I think it's a great idea. Anything that encourages people to come into the landscape, to get out, I mean, not just because it's lockdown, but at any point, and to not only to be interested by different responses to the landscape, but to make it richer, more interesting. Again, you're not just walking through a field in the rain. This is what you're looking at, and you are part of that heritage, and you are part of that landscape when you're in it. So the sense that there's a richer understanding, there's more going on than just what you can see with the naked eye, that there's a history and an archaeology or a folklore history to all of that as well. I find that very exciting. Hopefully other people will too.
Brilliant. That was lovely.
Okay, we're ready to roll.
So, describe how you responded to the artistic brief.
So when Lindsay brought the project to my attention, we sort of started looking around what we might do as part of this. We've both got a real interest in the history and folklore of Northumberland and Cumbria and the kind of surrounding areas, and we started to have a look at some of the bits of history and folklore in the area that we might respond to. And there was loads of it. You know, we like that idea that the people have been responding to their landscape in this way for centuries, and that they've, you know, the way that they usually did respond to the landscape was by recalling that history, by peopling the landscape with these sort of supernatural elements and telling all these stories of kind of strange happenings and buried treasures and things. We found stories of, you know, King Arthur from up around here and all sorts. But when Thirlwall Castle came up, I did remember there was a little story surrounding that, and we started to delve a little deeper into that, because that's about buried treasure. And I like that idea of the sort of supernatural, if you like, or the sort of half-remembered elements of the history being sort of buried under the ground. I thought was a really nice idea to go with. And so Lindsay was working in the kind of ballad tradition, sort of wrote a narrative ballad to do with that. And I kind of prepared it as a sort of told story, and we tried to do a piece that would blend those two elements nicely to kind of bring that out of the landscape a little bit and start to reach in and pull some of these old stories out. I think people forget a lot of the people, you know, would point these bits of the landscape out and draw out these stories in the past, and I think it's nice to be able to do that again, really, in a slightly more modern digital way, I guess.
I think there's something about the process of you and Lindsay working. I know this is a little bit off-piste. Do you want to describe the process of how you and Lindsay work together?
Yeah, so I mean we've known each other for a long time, decades, and we've really wanted to work together for quite a while on a project like this. So, you know, because we've done bits and bobs together before, combining kind of folk tales and this ballad tradition of sort of narrative or storytelling songs. And so really we kind of bounced the research backwards and forwards online, because obviously difficult to meet up in lockdown to do it. And then it was basically a case of kind of Lindsay sending me the ballad that she'd written, and me trying to make sure that the story kind of hit other beats of the overall tale than the ballad did, and then going around to record the sort of told story and making sure that complemented the musical elements and trying to kind of weave them together. But it came together quite naturally, I think, in the end. It was, yeah.
I'll go back onto the roof. So, how does your work relate to the location?
So the story that we've chosen to tell is actually a really old folk tale around Thirlwall Castle. I originally found it in a book called The Minstrelsy of the English Border, which I think is a bit of a kind of companion piece to Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders. And it contains this ballad about the Baron of Naworth Castle and the Baron of Thirlwall Castle, who's a notorious reaver. And these are sort of figures that come out a lot in the history of this region, and particularly appropriate for something around collision and conflict. We started to look at this idea of the Baron being a reaver. A lot of the dialogue in the story is taken from historical documents around the border reavers. Some of the turns of phrase that come out in it and things are straight out of the historical documentation. But it is a fictional story, of course, but it's one that's been told in this area for a long time, and I think even if the story itself isn't strictly true, it remembers those circumstances on the border and the barons of Thirlwall. And we were able to bring in some of the other characters as well, who are real people. I mean, I think that's one of the nice things about these stories, is that they mingle the supernatural with real historical figures who people remembered, like Belted Will, and the barons of Thirlwall themselves, who have a kind of minor but colourful part to play in the history of England, Scotland, and the borders as a whole.
And finally, what's been your overall impression of the project?
It's been really nice in lockdown to have a project to concentrate on, quite frankly, and I like the overall idea of it, that it helps to bring the landscape to life for people who are exploring it a little bit. I think a lot of people who come on holiday to the north of England will know it's got beautiful scenery, but I think this allows you to kind of dig below the surface of that, really, and kind of bring out some of the stories of local communities and some of the experiences that this landscape inspires in people. I think that's just a really nice idea, a way to really enrich their experience of the land while they're here.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. When you started to talk.
That's great, thank you.
Oh, my hands are warmer now.
I never do anything without a round of applause. That's my motivation. Right, we're ready when you are.
So Emma, can you describe how you responded to the artistic brief?
So I really wanted to do something that was inspired by the Tipalt Burn. I wanted a piece of prose fiction, basically, so something telling a story, moving through time and explaining the things that if there was a goddess of the burn, what she would have seen. So I went to do some research into water goddesses in the area and discovered that there was a Roman water goddess called Coventina. And obviously there is no proof that the goddess of the Tipalt Burn is in fact Coventina, but she is connected to a number of Roman sites near here, and I just thought, wouldn't it be amazing to think about what the spirit of the river might have seen as she moves through time. So I ended up with this piece of fiction that tells the story, moving right the way through from pre-Romano Britain to the Romans themselves, and then onwards past the reavers, and then as the castle itself decays and starts to crumble into the burn, and it ends with her saying, I hope that you will remember me, basically.
Okay, thank you. So how does your work relate, and you can answer the same question, it says, how do your work relate to the location in which it's situated?
So it is very much taking place next to the burn, and I really hope that as people walk alongside the burn that they will be able to listen to the voice of the river goddess as she takes people on a journey through time.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the research that you did as part of your creative process?
Yes, so as I mentioned, Coventina was the sort of starting point. The piece is called The Memory of Water, so it is very much about grounded by the river goddess, but there's a lot of really interesting local legends. I actually grew up in this area, so I knew some of this already, and then some of it was completely new to me. So things like there's a Roman camp that was on the other side of Thirlwall Common, so I thought, well, the goddess could potentially have heard the Roman soldiers building Hadrian's Wall. They could also conceivably have rested by her banks as they were sort of walking from place to place from that camp. The border reavers is a really interesting story. The reavers have been right through history. This particular part of the world has been fought over all the time, which obviously ties into the theme of collision and conflict. So I wanted to have something that kind of reflected that. So there was the Romans and then also the border reavers. And there is actually a legend that a resident of Thirlwall Castle dropped a fabulous golden table either into the burn or into a deep well when there was a reaver raid. And I wondered, well, who would know where that was? Probably the water goddess. So I was trying to weave in as many local legends as possible. There's a few in there if people who do the walk are interested and want to research further, I mention a king who stayed there, and there's a story that Edward Longshanks actually stopped at the castle. And also there's a number of other legends, including the poet Sir Walter Scott. So if people want to go and look at that further, those are in there.
Thank you. Are you all right with your range?
Fine.
One last one. So what's your overall impression on the project?
It's been absolutely amazing at the end of such a difficult period of time to do something creative. So this project just came along at just the right time for me. I think the project, it reflects a lot of the history of the area and a lot of the issues that we're still having now with the collision and the conflict about the different uses of the area. And particularly during lockdown, I think those of us who live here actually really enjoyed being able to get out into the landscape, and we enjoyed sharing that with other people. But then sometimes there was a bit of conflict because people were coming from outside the area, and during coronavirus that was a bit of a concern. So yeah, for me it's been an amazing opportunity just to do something to tell people about some of the history and the legends, and to explore that in fiction, a part of the world that I really love and cherish and want to share with other people.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Perfect,
Well
thank
done.
you. Ready to go.
So, Ellen, describe how you have responded to the artistic brief.
So when the brief came out, I couldn't believe how much it chimed with me. At that point, it was the middle of lockdown, and I was thinking of getting out of the city and moving into the countryside. And within me, there was a lot of conflict about that. And this was a poem that I needed to write. So I started thinking about counter-urbanisation and the wider implications of me moving from the city to the countryside. And it just all kind of came out, really. It was a really personal reaction to something that I think a lot of people are going through.
Brilliant. Could you talk a little bit about the process of writing?
The writing process for me was highly personal. To start off with, I kind of just had to sit with my feelings about what it was like for me to move from the place where I was born and raised to this area, which is just so different from anything that I've ever known. And it was really useful to be able to speak to Malcolm, who is a community member here. He really guided me in terms of like what these communities think and feel about the area that they live in, and not only that, but how they regard people who move here. And that really gave me a lot of perspective to think about my own position here, and also to form a relationship. So the writing process allowed me to make some friends as well, which was pretty useful moving to a new area.
Rebecca, just point the mic up towards the mouth, please. No, just point it, keep it down, angle it up a bit more, that's it. Upwards towards the mouth, that's it, yeah, great. And just down out of shot slightly, that's it, that's great.
Excellent. So how does your work relate to the location on which it sits?
So you're on this walk and you're seeing these beautiful rolling hills and countryside, this vast expanse, and then you come to this village and you realise that people live here. This area is inhabited by humans, and it's made by humans as well as by natural forces. And so you're really confronted by that. You collide with humanity in that moment. So when you enter the village of Greenhead, you'll hear my poem. And I really hope that it brings you face to face with the people who live here and explores some of the conflicts that they face as a community that is so isolated.
What's been your overall impression of the project?
So as an emerging artist, I've been so supported by Greencroft. I felt like they gave me all of the resources and all of the emotional support and all of just everything that I needed to make this piece as good as it possibly could be. So I'd recommend anyone to work with them. And like on a bigger scale, I feel like projects such as this are highly necessary for rural economies and for the cultural landscape of areas such as this, and it's really important that people from all over support them, and thank you to them.
Lovely, thank you, Ellen.
Lovely.
Is that good? Have
Happy
you got
with that.
everything you need?
My name's Dan Fox. I'm a sound artist from South Cumbria, and I got involved in this project because I saw the brief and I thought it was really interesting. Collision and conflict. I did a bit of research and found out about the Syrian archers, horseback archers, who were based at Housesteads, and they used a special kind of bow called a recurve bow, which was traditionally made of wood, sinew and bone. And so I've been working with bows and arrows as my sources of sound for this. So I've worked with a bowyer and a fletcher and a horseback archer, collecting lots of those sounds and then used them as sample material to work with traditional rhythms from Syria, from Aleppo. I've got a book of Middle Eastern rhythms, and I've sort of translated the dum and bek sounds of the traditional drum to sounds that I've gathered from the bow. And I also wanted to use that to draw sort of comparisons between the Roman archers who are here 3,000 miles away from their home and the Syrians who are now having to be spread around the world because they're escaping civil war in Aleppo. So the piece is recorded also using binaural microphones, so especially for headphones. So as you walk along, you'll hear the sounds of horses and these rhythms created from the bows and arrows that I've collected along the side of this ditch that I'm standing in here.
Hi, I'm Jude Irwin, and I worked with the amazing Bridie Jackson, who has created the haunting musical composition Walls Within Walls for this app. When Bridie first asked me to collaborate on this project with her, both of us had our own ideas on our chosen theme of walls, but we always intended to draw inspiration from local people. We explored a number of ideas for engagement, finally fixing on the lockdown expedient of one-to-one chats by Zoom. This proved to be a great move. The conversations we had were variously moving, intense, funny, sad, quirky, educational and hopeful. As expected, that input from people who live, work and spend their leisure time in this amazing part of the world completely changed and enriched our own perceptions, resulting in this fabulous piece of music from Bridie.